Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game.
I got board game.
I got board game.
Board game.
I am Ben,
I'm John.
and today we are here to do a review of a game from one of our top 10 list of games we played in 2020. The recent video we did.
Yes.
So one of those top 10s. Whose top 10 is it from, John?
Mine,
From
because
John's
Ben doesn't
top
play
10.
fun games. Just kidding.
It is a good game though. I mean, I think it maybe just wasn't on my top 10 because I didn't play it this
I don't think
past
you played
year.
it. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's a bad game. And so that game that we are going to review for you today is
The Clankers in Space.
Blast Those Clankers, the board game.
Roger. Clank it's I forgot it cuts off here. But it's Clank in Space.
Clank in Space. Clank in Space. 3 exclamation points throughout it. And so Clank in Space, big box game by Renegade Games and Direwood Digital. This came out, I believe, Board Game Geek says it was a 2017 release. And so it came out a little bit after the original Clank, which we also reviewed, if you guys have seen it on this channel. Clank in Space is for 2 to 4 players. Box says it plays in 45 to 90 minutes, so around an hour and a half, which I think is about right. And yeah, it's kind of like a space theme version of the original Clank, which is fantasy theme, but there are also more to this game than the original. And so to give you an idea,
just a reskin of the old game, right? So
yeah. And so to give you an idea of how the game plays, we're gonna switch over to this image I have from Board Game Geek. And so, sorry, it's kind of blurry. This is the best image I could find of the game, mostly set up with mostly everything in the picture. It's hard to find it with everything. But to give you an idea of how it works, Clank, the original game, was very novel in being a deck building game mixed with basically dungeon diving, where each player is competing to dive into whatever dungeon, steal an artifact, get out, and hopefully get the most points at the end of the game. And so it was mixing deck building. Each person's building their own deck, which includes cards that help them move, help them purchase more cards to add to their deck, hopefully to move better or to fight and be safe, to not die while they're going down into the dungeon. And then so that they can hopefully get a treasure, get out and get more points than other players. Where then Clank in Space follows that same general idea. So I'm not going to teach all of original Clank again, but I am going to point out then the differences, the new things to Clank in Space. And so this is the board setup, and the thematic setup of the game is that you guys are all thieves, all of the players who have snuck onto Lord Erraticus's ship to steal his artifacts, his treasures. And so he's basically this evil conquering space lord, and you've decided to sneak onto his ship. And so this is the board for his ship, which has modular board pieces. Each of these kind of circular or even hexagon shaped parts are modular. So they can be arranged in different orders when you're setting up, or they can even be flipped over to slightly different arrangement of the spaces on it. And so that's one of the new differences to Clank in Space. The board is slightly modular in that way, or it can be set up slightly differently. And so then the other thing is, as you're moving along through these spaces, you'll be able to move through spaces that are connected with these lines between them. Those are kind of like the corridors connecting them. And so what's added is there's this hyperspace, hyperpad or hyperspace pad. Hyperlift, which then lets you move instantly to another part of it. So you're kind of going down this really fast lift to get around to different sections of the ship faster. And there's also these telepads throughout that can be used to teleport to each other if you have a telepass. which is like the key you have to buy to use it.
Mhm.
There's still these market spaces, which are then dedicated to buying stuff from the market, which include health packs and like the telepass I mentioned. There's also spaces that might have these power crystals, which is a new resource in the game that can combo with some of the cards that you get to buy on your turn from the adventure road that get added to your deck. And
Mhm.
so some of those cards will say if you have a power crystal in your possession, when you play that card, it does a certain extra ability. The other main thing, though, that the game adds is unlike the original, where you're all just diving down into the dungeon, the cave, to get to whichever treasure you want and then get out, you're actually not able to access the treasure locations from the beginning of the game,
Mhm.
which is split off where I'm drawing this line with my mouse. This
The
whole right side
command
of the
module.
ship is the command board or the command center of the ship. So that's where the different treasures are set up. But to get there, each player has to hack data ports along the way, which are these spaces with like a green computer screen with them. And so you have to choose to do that action when you're on one of these spaces on your turn to hack that terminal. And you have to hack two different terminals because basically once you hack one place, the security's onto you. So you have to go to a different port. But once you hack both of them, you're going to get a command token, which is this little token, which is the same image as the barrier on the board. And so with this command token, that then allows you to access the command center and get to the treasures. So without this, you can't get in, even if you have a telepass to use the telepads, even if you ride the hyperlift all the way down, you still can't get through that barrier until you have this token.
Mhm.
And then in usual fashion, you can then take one artifact at most and then try to get out to an escape pod, which as you can see here, there are 4 setups. So that's a small difference too from the original versus just getting above ground. In this one, there's actually 4 distinct ways to get off the ship, 4 distinct escape pods. So when someone takes it, they'll get the bonus points for getting all the way back. But then that pod is used. So then any other players then have to try to get to a different escape pod.
Yep.
Once you had hacked 2 terminals to get a command token, that will actually increase Lord Eradicus on his boss track, which then determines how many cubes he's drawing out from the bag at the end of a turn that he's attacking, which depends on if the adventure rose shows his icon on one of the cards, then you would do an attack similar to the original game with the dragon. But then also on the boss track, once he gets to a certain point at the top of the track, not only are more cubes drawn to damage the players, he also adds these red cubes to the bag that can be drawn. And so these red cubes are bounty hunters. And so bounty hunters, when they're drawn from the bag when he's attacking, they're obviously different from the player's Clank cubes that get added to the bag, because when a player's cubes are drawn, that specific player takes the damage. But then when a bounty hunter is drawn, everyone takes the damage. Also, the bounty hunter cube gets added back into the bag. So they can always potentially be drawn every time he attacks. And so that's how the game kind of gets faster towards the end of the game as he gets higher on the track.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think aside from that, aside from the modular board, the hyperpad, the telepad, and the command token and the bounty hunters and the escape pods, I think that's all. Those are all the new things. But everything else then is the original Clank game. And so, yeah, that's how the game plays differently with the new things in addition to the original Clank.
Well, there's one other thing, small thing, is I think in the cards they also introduce factions, right? So
true.
the cards also, there are certain factions that if you're familiar with certain other games, a lot of space games also do this, but like if you have 2 cards of the same color or faction, that they get bonus abilities. So that's a new introduction into this game as well that was not in the old one. Again, minor change or minor update.
No, yeah,
into the
that
game
is
they
important.
had.
Yeah, sorry I forgot that, but that actually is pretty important with how you build your deck too, right? Getting cards of certain factions so that they combo together when you can play them in the same turn. And we'll probably go into that a little more when we talk about the pros and cons right now. So getting into the pros, John, this was in your top 10 of games you played last year. So why did you like it so much?
So I liked it so much that I don't even have to talk about it. You just have to go play the game. That's
Actually,
all.
do you remember?
That's
Do you
all I'm
remember
gonna
what
say for my
position it
pro.
was for you?
Huh?
Do you remember what position it was for you?
I think it was number 4.
Yeah, it sounds
I
like it. I
believe, if
think
I
that
remember
sounds right.
correctly. It was number 4 out of the top 10 of the games I played this last year. Yeah, Clank in Space is awesome. If you watched our review, we talk about a lot of the positives in Clank already. So all of that and more in this game. I think Clank in Space takes a lot of the potential pitfalls that may, like the small cons I think we noted in Clank regular base Clank, and just made it better and fixed some of those issues. So one of the big examples is the inability for a person to just go straight to the treasures, right? So one of the strategies in the old game, it was something that some people had noticed or figured out, and then kind of focus, notice and would take advantage of, and it would force the game to just be a really fast game every single time you played, because someone would go in, run and grab like the level 5 treasure and just bounce, right? Because they can get 25 points pretty easily that way, right? But then that kind of forces, because in that game that forces the tracker, the death tracker to happen, because you only get 3 more turns after the first person leaves or dies, and then the game is over. But in this game, they changed both of those things. One, you can't just run and grab a treasure, and 2, there is no death tracker, right? Like there's no like 3, 2, 1, game is over tracker. It's as we showed, it's the way they go around it is that they add a lot of the red cubes, the bounty hunters, which are very, very, very dangerous, because I don't know if you mentioned what they do, but basically when the bounty hunter is drawn, everybody gets hit in the game. So everyone is taking damage at the same rate from that, in addition to any other cubes that get drawn. So it still accelerates the game, but it accelerates it in a more interesting way, where it gives you a chance to still escape. It's not a countdown timer for you to get out. It's can you survive long enough to escape and get out, which I think is one, more thematic in this space, because like bounty hunters would be chasing you and fighting, so you have a chance of escaping still, right? So, and then it just leads to you actually having a chance to play through the game, play out the game, versus this not arbitrary, because in Clank original, it is the sense of like the dragon attacks, so you're dead, right? Like, or like you're done, like you can't do anything else once the dragon pops out, and like ravages whatever he decides to do. So even that fits thematically with that game, but I definitely think that's a pro that they took in the right direction in Clank in Space.
Yeah, and I think those are kind of the main things we kind of learned about when we first learned the game, that then, again, like you mentioned, fix some of those issues that people were found with the original Clank. But then also, in a sense, what started pushing it to be more of what people would call a gamer game, or a gamer version of the original, right? Not making it just kind of short or compact or kind of like a race in a way, but then more focus on the actual deck building and how to hack the terminals in the right place and get in at the right time to then be able to get out. And so that's kind of when we'll also get into like talking about the details of the additions I mentioned in the brief rules overview. But I think that's something that I do like about what they did with Clank in Space, is that they made it a game that felt more substantial. Like the original was great, and obviously in our review we said great things about it, gave it a great rating, and I don't even mean to make it sound like daunting in any way to call it a gamer's game. Like I think it's still like not that hard to learn, right? It's not a heavy game now just because of these new things. It's a bunch of little small changes, but it does add up to making it feel more substantial than the original. Like I think one of those things that I would point out, and maybe John will point out the other ones, is like I think even just having that idea of the command token, right? That's kind of the way that the game keeps itself from being a race in and out, right? Where players have to hack 2 terminals to be able to get access to the actual artifacts that you're trying to steal. And so it, in one hand, people can think like, oh, it's just dragging on the game. But I think it actually keeps the pace more even, that players all have to do this to be able to actually finish the game.
Yeah. And I'll say another pro, and it's technically something that applies to the original Clank game, but this is more of a mechanics standpoint kind of introduction. We've talked about it before, this combination of deck building and adventuring, like dungeon delving. But I think we didn't directly or specifically address it that last time. But I think one of the things that I really appreciate about this game and the system that they've set up is it deck building typically tends to be this this style of playing a game where it's all about making your decks as efficient as possible while trying to gather points that sit in your deck, right? That typically is how a lot of the deck builders play, because that came from Dominion, which we also did a review of in the past. But I think one of the really cool things that what Clank and Clank in Space do, and especially in this game, is that when you build your deck, it's not a deck that's just focused on a single type of resource, right? That you're only basically just trying to get points to buy more cards that lets you buy more victory points for the end of the game. You have to balance different resources that you're collecting that get played through your deck as you're going through, right? Because in this game, right, you have the skills, right, which is part of the original game of buying the cards from the adventure row. You have movement, because that allows you to get in and out where you can actually escape or get the treasures in the first place and move around. And then there's combat, which is what kind of keeps you alive as you're going through, or gets you additional resources depending on, you know, what you're fighting. So, and then of course there's also the money resource as well. Like there's the cred chips or coins that are used for the market and are worth victory points at the end of the game. And then there's also that power crystal we mentioned. So like, this is not like a lot of deck builders, or like older deck builders had kind of always been focused on just the deck itself and playing on the deck only. And that it's one of those things of like, oh, someone built a more efficient deck because they were able to remove more cards, or they're able to just buy a lot of cards. But then it's typically really only about buying a lot of stuff, right? Or buying things in card format. But in this game, you're doing so much more than just that. And in this game, there is so many more things to do. As we were talking about, it's where are you positioning yourself as you're moving through the ship, right? Which command sections are you going to, you know, hack? Because you can only hack one, you can only hack one terminal in a module, and you have to move to a different module before you can hack again, right? You can't hack one and then right next to it hack the second one. You have to go to a different place. I believe that's a rule. I think you have to go to two different modules.
At least I know you can't hack the same one twice.
Yeah, you definitely can't hack the same one twice. I'm pretty sure it's also that you can't hack it within the same module. Maybe that's a house rule that I played with, because it does make the game more interesting by doing it that way. But that the fact that you still have to go to two different terminals is important, right? And I think
that's true. You're right. It is in the rules.
Not house rule.
Can't put your second data cube in the same module.
So you have to move, right? So then you have to plan your movements out carefully in that way too. And it's also a little bit about the luck of the draw through the deck building. And then, of course, like the adventure row, what cards are you getting? What kind of deck are you going to build? Like you still have that level of, of kind of figuring out what your strategy is. It's just so good. So good.
Well, yeah, to go into more details of what you just said, I think, definitely a pro of mine for this, which was also said for Clank, is that I don't usually like deck building games, even though I'm probably reviewing quite a few positively on this channel. It's still not a mechanic I would say I'm inclined to, aside from these newer games that are combining it with some other main mechanic. And so same thing with Clank is true with Clank in Space, that combining it with that dungeon diving aspect, which then involves what you just described, those other resources that you also have to consider versus just one money resource, basically, usually in more traditional deck building games. I do like all that's going on in this game because all the resources are also small things, right? I always want to kind of remind people that Clank, and even shifting over to Clank in Space, it's not like a huge jump, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just adding these small things, but then all these small things are important. So it's kind of up to you how you want to how much you want to pay attention to them, and you'll feel it too, right? Where if you approach it like a traditional deck building and you only try to get cards that can help you get more skill points to buy more cards, you're not going to move anywhere on the ship, right? Basically. But then also if you only get movement cards but no cards with swords to fight monsters, especially to go through paths that have monsters, you might lose life really quickly, you know.
And there's
so you
bounty
kind
hunters now.
Hmm?
And there's bounty hunters now who deal
Yeah,
damage.
and then I think added to this then with Clank in Space specifically is the way that John had brought up that rule of the cards having factions, right? Certain cards have one of three factions, and so then that can also influence how you want to build your deck. Because I guess to elaborate on that rule now is that with the different factions like Science, or I think like Rebel, or something like that, Maverick, certain cards will have those factions, and so what that means is they'll have other cards will have a line saying that if you played a card with the same faction on the same turn, then you get to activate that part of the card. And so again, that can then influence how you want to plan your deck of like, oh, do I want to get maybe more Science cards now because I happen to get one for a certain ability on it anyway, so might as well get more Science cards. And so that's just adding to another small thing that you can consider when you're building your deck now. I think another pro, again, with the board setup, is the modular boards. I mean, I think immediately this is small for me. In most games, I think this would be bigger for a bigger pro for certain people because it adds variety to the game. Admittedly, I haven't ever really felt that like the board is necessarily that different when you flip to another side. Like, for example, you can see here, this is one of the modular parts of the ship, one of the modular boards. And this side is, it says the promenade. And then when you flip it to the other side, it is the med lab. And so the setup of the spaces on both sides are clearly different. And so I think that's nice if you're looking for that variety to mix things up, right? Like flipping this or even placing it on a different part of the ship. But for me, it didn't necessarily stand out as like, oh, this side has more life, where then this side doesn't have that as much. So, you know, maybe like this side will influence how we play, and it could, right? And so that's why for me, this is kind of a small pro, where it's like for people who notice it and plan around it, it can add that variety. For me, it just kind of is that variety in idea, which it could be good for people. I don't think it's bad though. I definitely don't think it's a negative that they did that. And in that way, I think it, provides a pro as a pro in its variety for people who actually want it.
Oh, man, what else can I say that's good? I feel like we've talked about all the good stuff from even the old one, the first review. So I'm like, I don't want to repeat too much of stuff. I think, yeah, it's.
Well, I would say then in that case, I mean, you can still think about it.
You
have a few
again,
smaller ones. One is the theme. Even though personally, I would say I'm inclined to a fantasy theme. I think I'm also very particular about the kind of fantasy I like. So I might not usually come across the fantasy I like that much in certain fantasy board games. But with this sci-fi kind of space theme, I think it still does it well with, you can see in the artwork in John's background, but then also the way they include the kind of their take on certain sci-fi things people already know. Because in the original, they would also do that with the fantasy theme, you know, change name of certain fantasy tropes or ideas people know. And so I just have examples of a few cards here of, you know, they incorporate from different sci-fi movies and series, like this light scooter, kind of like Tron, right? Which then gives you more movement when you play it, to Princess Helia, like some other princess people might know, who is also part of this. I believe that's like the rebel faction.
Yeah.
To this Jidu infiltrator, which is similar to Princess Helia, if you guys know the reference. So I think in the same kind of way they incorporated the theme into the original, I think they do that well with this sci-fi theme. So I do enjoy the theme with this still. And then the other small thing I was going to say is production, again, is great, right? It's similar components, like you saw the modular piece of the shipboard, to then there's the deck of cards, which has a whole lot of adventure cards, so a lot of variety there that you can purchase and add to your deck, to then the cubes, right? The Clank cubes and character meeple that each player gets, to then the credit tokens, which are all cardboard punch outs, and then everything fitting into the box in its own insert, which I think is well produced. It fits everything just fine. So I always appreciate a game that comes with an insert and fits everything well. Good storage solution. So yeah, another small pro, the production. Was there anything else you wanted to add, John?
I just feel like if I add any more pros, I'm just going to start talking about gameplay and strategy and all that, which, while I'd love to, that would just make this video too long. And if you want to hear more about that, maybe we can talk about that another time.
Or find a time to play with John.
Or find the time to play with me, and I'll tell you everything about it.
So yeah, so all of these pros are mainly focused on either pros we had for the original Clank that are also true here, 2 pros for the new additions to it. And so going on to the cons then, any negative sides to this new version?
Yeah, so there are a couple small ones that I would say. As mentioned, it is adding a lot of small rules to add, so it can be overwhelming or daunting for people who haven't played ever, right? Or like either who've never played Clank at all in any way. So like if you've never played the original Clank, jumping into Clank in Space is a lot because you're learning about the base game and all of these new small additions. So it is a lot to learn if you are kind of jumping into this for the first time. And that's kind of talking about the gamer's game version of this, right? It's kind of alluding to that. It's not the easiest first time play for people, especially if it's the first time playing this series, right? Clank at large. I think in that, I would say the other thing that can get a little bit long or tedious is gameplay length. Is that this game, as we mentioned, does extend how long this game plays to reach conclusion. I honestly think that an hour 30-minute is a generous and a fast gameplay of this sometimes. Maybe if people are very familiar with the game, they can play this game a lot faster, but you have to be very familiar with this game to play it a lot faster. What tends to happen is there is a lot of stuff going on that you have to think about. So people taking their, trying to figure out what they want to do with their turn will take time. Right. And also, as all deck builders tend to have, is there's a lot of drawing mechanics that happen or reshuffling mechanics that can happen, which also just extends time because you're doing the physical activities and you have to reevaluate based on what you're drawing or based on what you're seeing. So I would say the other kind of negative to the game, and again, it's not a hard negative, it's just more like it is a time commitment to play this game from start to end. Right. So if you're looking for a faster experience or if you're playing with a group, know that this is going to take some time. And whenever you go into it, just expect to be spending, a significant portion of time in this game. It could be your whole board game night session to play one game of Clank in Space. Right. So that's kind of my 2 initial cons.
And so then actually, how long would you actually kind of give the average time length for a game?
So if I were to give the average time length, I mean, I think an hour 30 to 2 hours is probably what I would say is the typical experience for people playing. If it's a bunch of first times or mostly first timers playing the game, it could extend up to 3 hours for a session. Just because people will be asking questions, they'll be trying to figure out what's going on, so on and so forth. Versus at least in original Clank, the game could be ended pretty quickly, right? And then you can restart a new game because someone forced the end game to happen, right? But in Clank in Space, that's not doable, not in the same way. So
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the box saying 45 to 90 minutes is off. I would say at least an hour. Like even
yeah.
if, like you mentioned, people who are familiar, I would say if you're playing quickly, know what you're doing, it's still probably going to be an hour for like 3 or 4 players. And so actually, yeah, both of the things that you said are the only two cons I could think of for the game too. Again, I want to emphasize, like I said already, like it's not a heavy game though, right? It's
Yeah.
not like I wouldn't put it up with say like viticulture and kind of big sit down, a lot of different things to build up. But it is all these small things to consider. And so yeah, I agree that if people are not familiar with Clank at all or deck building at all, this would be a lot to kind of take on at once.
Yeah.
But then for people who have played even just a deck builder a few times and are willing to like add on just like the next step, I think they could either jump to Clank or Clank in Space. Kind of depends on how comfortable they are with deck building already. And if they played Clank even just like once or twice, I think they can easily jump to Clank in Space. So yeah, so it does kind of add a lot of those things that are in our pros, but then yeah, it can be kind of a jump for people who are just completely unfamiliar. And then yeah, time. It definitely does take more time than the original. So but yeah, like I said, those are the only things I can think of that
The
are
other small minor con, and again, it's a minor con, it's not a significant one, is it does have a large footprint, so you do need a large space to play. But I mean, it's like any large games that we talk about. This is why it's technically not a con per se. It's more of a just be aware of, is you do need space because the board itself needs to be set up, and then you have your own player section, right? So you have a space where you can play your deck, and there's also the adventure row, and there's the free cards or like the open cards for anybody to buy. So it does take some space, so you will need a somewhat sizable table to be able to play on, or a surface to play on, in order to set up. But again, it's not a con, it's just more of a just know that when you
it is what
ready for
comes
that.
with a big box game. And it still also isn't necessarily as big as other big box games where players have like the main board and the sideboard and their own board, right? It's
I was
mainly
gonna say, ironically, I was like, I think Viticulture's box is smaller than Clank's
yeah,
box,
yeah,
but is a
but
bigger
it takes up more
footprint.
space, I would say, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking too. So for those of you who've seen our review of Viticulture or have played it, know that I wouldn't put this up there with taking as much space as Viticulture.
Yeah,
But
Viticulture
it
takes
is
way
still
more
a
space.
big box game, similar, just slightly smaller without individual player boards, more just you need your area for your own deck and tokens. But then there is of course the main board and the sideboard and those cards for the market and such. But yeah, so with that said, we will go on to our rating, and John guesses the weights.
Wait.
So John, I mean, this was again on your top 10 play to 2020,
Yeah,
but
5 out of
obviously that
10.
was
No
ranked
good.
number 4, but you didn't give an actual rating at the time, right?
Yeah, we weren't giving ratings at that time, so 5 out of 10. Play it or leave it. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it was because it was only
So I
number
had to
4.
I did go back to look at our previous rating because I did want to make sure I wasn't gonna mess up and rate this lower than the
Lower than the
original,
original
because that would
Clank
be
rating.
really bad, because you've already heard me basically say that this is better than the original. um but I think this is, as I said, I think it just basically elevates the original experience and just makes it a better game, right? Like just everything they introduced into this game overall is just pieces, components, actions, thematic, changing board, right? Because even the old game had a flipping board that there was 2 sides. This game has 6 different modules, or 3 different modules that can be flipped over. I think the command and the start base don't get to flip, but like you have those 3 other pieces that can flip. So you have those permutations of the amount of different potential opportunities, and they can be moved in different kind of sections to be sit in. So it does, like as Ben was saying, while it's not the biggest change, it does add variety. It adds flavor. It adds kind of a difference in how you approach your play style as you go through the game, in addition to the cards that show up. And I think, you know, all of the new resources, it's things that both benefit the player, but also introduce a lot of new dangers that players need to go through. So it's not a simple walk in the park because you're technically stronger, or you technically have more opportunities to do things. There's also a lot more threats involved in the game, which you need to navigate, which I think is, you know, perfect for an expansion of, you know, or a standalone expansion or a standalone game that builds upon what has already been put out, right? It introduces enough newness to the game that makes it stand out as a significantly different experience entirely. So my rating is an 8.5 out of 10. So I give it the 0.5 more than the original Clank. I was debating about a 9. I don't know if it reaches quite the 9 level. 9 is a very, very, very high level to give to a game, right? In terms of its like perfection. This is very close. This might even be close to an 8.75 than just a strict 8.5. But I would definitely put this as one of the top games that I feel like I've ever played, right? In that sense. It's always an enjoyment. If anyone even mentions the fact that they're interested in wanting to play this game, I will be like, let's do it right away, 100%. Or I will even say, have you ever heard of this game? You should probably play it if you haven't played it, right? So that is my rating. Weight, 2.38.
Okay, let's remember that 2.38. And so before I show the Board Game Geek page with that has my rating and the weight, I will explain that John copied me,
No, he
and
copied me. Always copied me.
and my rating, I will just straight up say, is also an 8.5, but John copied me. And it's actually the same reason, basically, where it is just that 0.5 better than the original. I believe the original I gave it an 8. And so, I mean, 8 is very solid for the original, and I still have the original down there along with this new version. Because I think, again, from what we just said in the con section, that the original, I think, is still what I would start with if someone is unfamiliar completely with these modern games with deck building. And so that's the one I would like introduce people to this idea of deck building with something else. But then quickly after, I think Clank in Space has like the more exciting, smaller mechanics added to it. And so I would want to move on to that if people are still interested in how Clank played. And so it is better. And again, it's not a 9. Similar to what John said, yeah, that's a big jump. If I were to go from an 8 to a 9 would almost be like I could replace the original with this one. But again, I have both, so I don't think it's necessary to replace it completely. At least considering the people I end up playing or teaching games to. And so, yeah, I give it an 8.5. It is one that I would want to play more. Just kind of that sit down experience and everyone kind of thinking differently about how they want to go about handling all these small mechanics or resources in this new version. And so with that, I gave it an 8.5, and John guessed the weight of 2.38. And so on Board Game Geek, let's see how close John was.
Better not add any weight changes to it.
2.53. Close. I was getting worried. You're pretty close.
I was gonna say like 4.5, 2.45, which would have been closer, but unfortunately.
So yeah, 2.53 is yeah, pretty good. It's like a good light to medium range. I think that's what that is.
It's like right in the middle.
Let me see. Is there?
Oh no, I guess 3 is in the middle. Never mind. So
does it show? Yeah, if light is medium. I'm guessing it's it is like the medium light range, because I think 3 is more like the medium, full-on medium.
Yeah.
But yeah, 2.53 light to medium. Yeah, it is still that feeling. Again, it's not that much heavy of a game to push into. I would say a full-on medium weight. And then the community average rating is a 7.9. So a little lower, which is interesting. I thought it would be
it's
actually
probably because there's not as many gamers. So
and it could be that there's just more people who stuck to the original, you know. because for you guys, for your information, so you know, both Clanks actually have expansions. I believe the first one has 2 or 3 expansions, and then Clank in Space has its own 2 expansions, which I don't have, but from what I saw, it adds one of them adds like a whole new ship board, so a whole new board you're playing on with a new boss or villain that might function differently. I'm not too sure. And then there's also the earlier expansion adds a couple more modular boards that you can switch in. At least that. And then there's also obviously more cards that get added to the deck, maybe different kinds of cards or resources too. I'm not exactly sure. But if you guys are interested and have played Clank in Space, just keep in mind there are 2 expansions that can be added to it if you liked it that much. And so with that, that is our review of Clank in Space. If you guys found this helpful, hope you'll share this video, this review with your friends, family, people you play board games with. I hope you get to try this game. Both of us really like this game, as you can tell. And hope you'll consider subscribing to this YouTube channel and following on Instagram at I Got Board Game. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Take care.